So I'll go over, yeah, some of our insect survey results from this year and go over how you can access them and how you can interpret them when you're looking at making decisions for your own fields. So we run the Alberta Insect Pest Monitoring Network, which is a part of the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. And we're responsible for insect surveys and monitoring across Alberta. In 2025, we sampled over 3,000 field sites, and that is really thank yous to uh, all of our volunteers, all of our boots on the ground, the agricultural fieldmen and municipalities who are going out and doing a lot of that collecting. Our team has 3 people on it, and there's no way that we could cover 3,000 fields across Alberta by ourselves. So we greatly appreciate the help that we have. And as part of the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, we survey for 7 core insect pests, as well as conducting invasive pest surveillance and taking on additional projects to survey for insects that come up as emerging issues. So the 7 core pests that we survey are listed here, and we'll go through them in somewhat of a order following the season when they come up, as opposed to any alphabetical order. But if you're wondering how you can get updates about what we're doing and get notifications about when these survey results come out, you can follow the Agri-News newsletter produced by the Government of Alberta. And you can sign up to get those emails straight to your inbox, or you can go to that website and open up issues as you wish and go check out past issues as well. Now, if you're looking for our website in particular, the Alberta Insect Pest Monitoring Network, can be found at alberta.ca/Alberta Insect Pest Monitoring Network with dashes in between each of the words, or you can click the QR code in the corner here, and that will take you right to that website. So when you get to that website, we've got a little blurb that describes our network and what we do. We also have an overview of the group and our surveillance program, a link to see survey results, and information on how to get involved in further resources. So if we click those survey results, that drops us down on the web page to a table here where we have our live feed maps on the left and the annual survey results on the right. So first we'll go through all of the live feed maps and what you'd see when you follow through those links. So these provide in-season updates as that monitoring is happening, as opposed to a published map that comes out at the end of the year. And you can actually add to most of these. So for these maps, location is blurred to 4 townships. So we're not showing the exact location of the field where that monitoring is taking place. They're confidential. For the cutworm report tool, you can submit those reports online as you're doing that surveying or after. And if you're interested in participating in the Bertha armyworm, diamondback moth, or wheat midge pheromone trap networks, then you can contact us for more information, because those are surveys where we're going to actually send you out the materials so that you don't have to track down those supplies yourself. And I think we might still be accepting volunteers for these. It kind of depends where we're at for supplies and if Shelley ends up having time to order anymore if we run out. So if you click down to the section about getting involved, got some information on how you can sign up for our annual surveys, as well as not just taking part in the Bertha armyworm and diamondback moth pheromone traps, but you can also sign up to allow us access to your land and get the results of our surveys for your specific fields. Or you can report scouting results as well. Cabbage seed pod weevil, not quite applicable in your area, but the cutworms you can definitely participate in. And when you click that link, it takes you to a survey form here that takes maybe about 5 minutes to fill out. And you can notice it says up here, you don't actually require your location information. We'd appreciate if you put at least something. so that we can at least determine the general area or municipality, and that location information will be blurred when it's shown on the map, so you don't have to worry about that. But all of the other information you do need. So the date that you collected that information, what crop you were in, what cutworm species you suspect that you have in your fields with links for help with identification, what sort of general area it's impacted, and some crop history. We do have the collected by information mostly required because this is a farm that's available to anybody, and we want to make sure that it's a real person actually in Alberta filling it out and not somebody who is, just having a laugh somewhere else. And that's a fairly easy and quick to submit form. And in season, all of those results get populated into a live map here that shows information about the general municipality, the blurred location, and what cutworm species we have had reported, as well as in what crop it was. And this is a great tool to check to get an idea about what cutworms are showing up in season as folks are doing that scouting. It gives us an idea of what areas are having issues. It is a completely voluntary tool, so we only have as much information as we get reports. So we really strongly encourage anybody who has the interest and the time to submit their reports. It really helps us out, not only with people getting a chance to look at the reports on the live map, but for our program, it helps us get a better idea about what cutworm issues folks are having in the province. And then stakeholders can also look at the annual reports put out from this to get an idea about what sort of level of issues cutworms are, when we're looking at different research objectives and things like that. So we include cutworm species in that map, even though it can be a bit difficult to conduct that identification, because it can be quite helpful to know what species we're generally dealing with in the province. So this table here is from the cutworm pests of crops on the Canadian prairies. And the table was created by Jennifer Otani, who you saw speak last week, and John Glabowski, and was edited by Kevin Float when he put together this guide. And the table's much bigger than this actually, but it shows for a number of different common cutworms, their feeding habits, as well as their life cycle. And that life cycle is fairly relevant when we're looking at that monitoring. So for redback cutworm, which is the species that we had reported in the Peace region, they're going to overwinter in that egg stage. So those adults will be laying their eggs in the late summer, early fall, and they're looking for fields that have some nice green growth to lay those eggs. So fields that have had a fall, a lot of fall weeds or some fall regrowth are going to be places that will have more redback cutworms. And then those eggs are not going to hatch until the spring, when those small larvae are going to start feeding early on in the season. And you have that window of time as they grow and develop to scout for them, and then to potentially implement control if you have an economic level. Whereas our army cutworms, which we did have some reports in southern Alberta, they're actually going to overwinter as larvae. So they, depending on the season, can start to feed even in the fall and do some of that feeding early on in the spring if they manage to get active. So there's the possibility with army cutworms that by the time they're in a crop field and that crop is emerging, they might already have done most of their feeding and might actually be pretty close to pupating and not necessarily going to do as much damage. And a similar case for our dingy, another common cutworm that we saw across the province quite a bit, except that they have a much longer range that they stay larvae. So we do have quite a long period in which they can pop up as an issue. Now, if you also want to get a bit of a head start on those cutworms, you can look at those maps. But also, I always recommend if you're out, not necessarily tilling as deep as this guy is here, but in the spring, if you're doing a heavy harrow or even when you're seeding and you have an entourage like this following you, it's a good idea to pop out and take a look in the dirt behind you, because there's a good chance that all of these gulls are coming down for a nice cutworm feast. They might also be eating up wireworms, so it's good to do that scouting, and a good idea of a field to keep an eye on before you start to have any potential emergence issues that warn you about cutworms. Now for our next live map, we have our diamondback moth survey results. And these are the numbers of adults that are captured in pheromone baited traps. And these traps are set out during May and a bit into early June. And the intention of these traps is really to get a good grasp on the early season migration of diamondback moth to see when those moths are arriving and if we have a large early migration. After these traps are finished, we can still have diamondback moth migrate up from the States. However, when we have a major diamondback moth outbreak year, often it's because those moths are arriving very early in the season in large numbers. So even though we have a low capture last year in these traps, there still were some fields that could have high diamondback moth numbers, but we didn't necessarily expect a province-wide outbreak. And so it gives us a bit of an early indication and helps us prioritize some of that scouting. It doesn't mean that scouting for diamondback moth isn't still important, but you can keep an eye on this live map next season. And it's not necessarily a map that the results carry over year to year, but that you can check out over the season. So our Bertha armyworms traps similarly captured male moths that are attracted to the female produced pheromone. And these are a native species that is going to overwinter in Alberta. However, Bertha armyworm populations tend to fluctuate in a boom-bust cycle. And so it's a good indication early on in the season to figure out where we are in that cycle and if we have hotspots developing. So all of the trap capture information gets uploaded as folks are putting it in. So you can take a look in season and watch these numbers climb as we get more moths captured over the course of the season. And it gives a bit of an early warning about what sort of Bertha armyworm issues we might face later on in the season. Our wheat midge trap is a little bit different. So we are still using a pheromone trap to capture males. However, with our wheat midge system, it's really the timing of that capture that's important. So all of these traps in the network are placed out once the wheat fields that are being monitored are just getting into heading. So from boot crack until anthesis is when we really have that susceptibility to wheat midge. So we're tracking to see if that emergence is happening during that period. And, I will say that some of those accounts do still tend to come in after anthesis. So you do want to keep track of the staging in your own field, but it's a good indication of whether we're starting to see wheat midge flying and help getting an idea of whether you should be out doing that scouting yet or not. So if we move on to our annual maps. So the first one we'll go through is pea leaf weevil. And if you go to that website, you'll have a small short description of the methodology, the 2025 survey findings. You'll see the map and a text interpretation, as well as historical survey maps, so you can see all of the previous years. So for our pea leaf weevil, this is a survey where we're looking at damage to estimate the number of adults. So you can see there at that arrow, those U-shaped notches that are left by the adults. And we use the counts of those notches to estimate the number of adults that are doing that feeding, which then relates at least somewhat to the number of larvae. It's not as clear whether that number of adult weevils always relates well to damage. And we did see that this year where we had very high numbers of notching, around Edmonton and in central Alberta and some in the south, but not necessarily complaints of economic issues. But you can take a look at the map and combine that with your own in-field experience with pea leaf weevil numbers to make decisions about whether applying a seed treatment is worthwhile. So taking a closer look in the piece here, we do see that we do have a bit of an increase in pea leaf weevil. So each of these dots here is one spot where we surveyed. and they're all colored with our different densities here on the right. And then the area in between the dots, we have an estimate of density that's made using statistical methods. So we do have a bit of a hotspot in Saddle Hills here, but the one thing, a few things with pea leaf weevil is that our notching is temperature dependent. So we had a fairly warm spring, and when it's pretty warm, those weevils are going to do more nibbling. And so that same number of weevils can do a higher number of notching. And that nibbling itself isn't going to be our economic issue, it's going to be damaged by the larvae. In Alberta, but especially in the Peace, we do see a lot of other Cetona species, and these weevils might do some feeding on peas before they go to lay eggs on other crops. And again, it's not that adult feeding that's going to cause damage. So there's a possibility that in some of these fields that other Cetona might have done that notching. And this is just looking at the spring counts and doesn't necessarily factor in what we saw in the fall. So, we had quite a dry summer up in the Peace region, and pea leaf weevil doesn't really love dry conditions. They do need a certain amount of moisture in order to thrive. So these numbers may actually decrease as all of the larvae that developed they might not all have developed well. And another thing to keep in mind if you're out in the spring and seeing lots of notching in pea fields is that while we do have an economic threshold for adult damage, more research has shown that the foliar insecticide applications are not as effective as the seed treatments. So the seed treatments really are kind of the gold standard if you are having pea leaf weevil issues. So we'll move on to our grasshopper survey. And this is a survey that is conducted by the Association of Agricultural Fieldmen. And if it wasn't for them, we would not be able to get a survey of this quality and quantity. So for this survey map, we actually don't have the points illustrated because there's over 2,000 of them and it would be a very cluttered map. And we just show that estimation of density made from those points. Now, this is a survey where we're looking at the number of adult grasshoppers in the late summer and fall, because these are the individuals that are going to be laying eggs for the spring. And there's a risk rating that is based strictly on those counts that has been developed and verified over the years. So you can take a look at this map and in combination with what you're experiencing in your own fields as well as interpretations, determine some of your scouting priority. If you are considering putting in a crop that is really susceptible to grasshopper damage and feeding, it can potentially impact some rotation decisions or whether you want to use a trap crop or a border for that crop. Taking a closer look in the piece, you can see 2024, last year, we had some hot spots with the higher grasshopper numbers, but 2025, we had very high numbers across the piece. With high numbers of Brunner's grasshoppers. So our grasshopper life cycle is pretty much the same for all of our pest species. So all of our pests overwinter as eggs in the soil. So those overwintering temperatures really don't impact them that much there. And then in the spring, they're going to hatch and emerge and then go through 5 nymphal instars where they're feeding and shedding their skins and growing. And the speed at which this happens really depends on those weather conditions. In hot, dry conditions, that development occurs very quickly. So we have them doing all of that feeding in a short window earlier on in the season when our crop plants are more susceptible to that feeding damage. Whereas if we have a cooler, wetter season, then this life cycle happens much more slowly and that feeding is spread out. And then we also have conditions where those plants can tolerate that damage a little more. And then these species all reach adulthood and lay eggs in this late summer and fall for as long as they survive most of the fall and up to frost often. So some of our big mortality points for our grasshoppers are when they first hatch and we have these tiny little nymphs. They can be really impacted by heavy rains and by disease. They can still be impacted by disease and natural enemies as they grow, but really those early instars is where we see a high amount of mortality. And we do see some natural enemy damage happening with our eggs, with our blister beetles doing that feeding and some parasitism. So our two-striped or clearwing, migratory, these species all have a 1-year life cycle where they complete this cycle completely in 1 year. And importantly, the eggs of these species can do quite a bit of their developing in the fall. They can develop up to about 80% if the fall conditions are really warm and they get laid early on in the season. And then they get a head start to finish that development in the spring and hatch really early. Our Brunner's grasshoppers have a similar life cycle, but it's spread out over 2 years. So for our Brunner's, we'll look at 3 different examples. So our first 2 at the top, say Tim and Jim. Tim and Jim here, they have already been sitting in the soil for 1 year. So in the spring of our year 1, they're hatching and doing their growing and feeding. And then they grow up to mate and lay eggs. Now Bob here was just laid last fall. So Bob's going to sit in the soil waiting, finishing up that development, but needs another cold period before he can hatch in year 2 to emerge and grow. Now we've got Tim and Jim's kids here because they're just laid last fall. They're going to continue on waiting in the soil until year 3. So our high Brunner's years in the piece seem to usually have been odd years. In even years, we don't necessarily see those high numbers, but it's still a bit of a tentative relationship, and there's a lot more questions than there are answers. So our Brunner's in the piece are really seeming to have that 2-year life cycle where those eggs are sitting in the soil partly developed and then need a second cold period in order to finish developing. Now, there's a lot of questions there. Some older research shows that some different populations of Brunner's grasshoppers might have variation in how much they require that second cold period and whether they require a third cold period. And the mechanism is not really clear either. So with those question marks, we don't know if in the future, if say we have more winters where we have fluctuating temperatures with warm and cold periods intermixed instead of a more solid cold, is that going to trigger Brunner's grasshoppers, their life cycles to change? We don't know. And not necessarily all of those Brunner's are perfectly synced up. So we do still have Brunner's grasshoppers that are going to come out during those even years. So for our Brunner's grasshoppers, that egg laying capacity in our peak years is really important. So how many females and how many adults we have out laying eggs and how early they get out and what those egg laying conditions are like. Our egg development conditions are not as much of an issue with our Brunner's grasshoppers. They're going to have an entire summer sitting in the soil to finish up their development and be ready to emerge in the spring. For our other species that have a 1-year life cycle, because those eggs can develop up to 80% in the fall, and get that head start on their development in the spring, both that egg laying capacity and the egg development in the fall are important in determining how early and how many grasshoppers we see. So really how many adult females and how soon they start laying eggs is really the most important thing. Previous research has shown that the earlier those females can start laying eggs, the more eggs they lay, and a lot of them will continue laying eggs until we get to a hard frost. So last year, we saw pretty quick development for all of the grasshopper species that were out and about, and any hoppers that were active likely laid lots of eggs. They had good fall egg laying conditions, and those females reached adulthood pretty quick. There was lots of Brunner's in this year, so we can expect high numbers of Brunner's grasshoppers in 2027. But there was lots of other species like clearwing grasshopper too. So scouting it for grasshoppers is still going to be important in 2026 in the piece. And those spring conditions are going to be really important for determining how much of an issue those grasshoppers that are emerging are. When you're out doing that scouting, Our survey takes a look at the numbers of adult grasshoppers because they're the ones laying eggs. But for making any economic decisions, those smaller grasshoppers really are your target. So we've got a nymphal two-striped here. You can tell that he's still a nymph and not fully grown by his little crop top wings. When he reaches adulthood, those wings will reach almost to the end of his abdomen, and you'll see those stripes really clearly on them. And so this third instar stage here, where he's got those little bitty wings, is the perfect stage to target if you need to make control decisions. So at this stage, he's still small enough that he has a lot of eating and growing to do, and he's still small enough that he's not that mobile, and still small enough that those insecticides will impact him fairly well. But it's also far enough in the season that we probably can assume that most of the eggs that have been a little slower have hatched and those grasshoppers are out. When you're doing those field side counts, you also want to make sure that you're not moving in a straight line from spot to spot, and you want to move in kind of a zigzag pattern. If you move in a straight line from spot to spot, you're going to have your first count with 2 grasshoppers, and your last count might have 200 because you've all herded them down that line. And with these smaller grasshoppers as well, it's really important to make sure that you check for stragglers. These guys aren't going to be as mobile as our adult grasshoppers, so it's a bit easier to miss them as they're hopping out of the spot that you're visualizing in the grass. So it's really important when you get to that spot, to take a look, move some of that plant material around, and some of those small grasshoppers might actually not have even left that area as you approached. So next we'll move on to our Bertha armyworm. So not only do we have the live map for the trap results, but we also compile that into an annual map summarizing those results. So this map shows the season total of all of the moths that are captured, which are then averaged per trap. And that's important because in the piece, we ask our cooperators to only put out 1 Bertha armyworm trap because of the number of bumblebees that are captured, whereas in the rest of the province, 2 Bertha armyworm traps are set out per site. And these traps can capture from a wide area. So these results don't necessarily relate strictly to the field that they're placed in, but more regionally. And that cumulative capture gives us an idea of what our outbreak risk is. So we see generally in the province a bit of an increase in some of our hotspots, although we did see a decrease of Bertha armyworm in the piece. It's still important to run those traps and to keep an eye out for them as they can spread quite a bit if we do end up getting an outbreak. But that little population from 2024 seems to have really died down in 2025. In Saskatchewan, we saw very high numbers of Bertha armyworm, and there was quite a bit of spraying, which is relevant because if we do see a Bertha armyworm outbreak, often Saskatchewan gets it first and then we see it. But there was also a lot of disease in these fields, so that outbreak might actually, kind of be stopped before it starts. And for Bertha armyworm outbreak dynamics, we've got some historic maps here. And you can see that typically we do have a few hotspots that start to build with some increasing populations. Those populations then start to spread outside of those individual hotspots, and we get a more widespread outbreak that occurs across the province. And this is a pretty typical pattern for Bertha armyworm outbreaks. So not saying that we're for sure going to get one, but just that we really want to keep a close eye on it for next year to see what that population does. Now for our wheat midge survey, this is a survey where we look at the number of cocoons that are in the soil after harvest. And to do that, we collect 17 soil cores from wheat fields. And this is, there's a little bit of extra depth there that's going to be taken off before that core goes into the bag. And those 17 cores are then washed through essentially some really fine colanders And then in that bottom level, the tiny wheat midge cocoons are all collected. And I say that we do this, but I mean the royal we, because it was Shelley and Tanner that did all of the washing in the fall, and I managed to miss it. And then Shelley takes those cocoons and pops them open to look for wheat midge parasitoids. You can see here that little parasitoid larva with the little bit of wheat midge tissue in its gut, making it look kind of like a fried egg. So we take the results from those 17 cores and we take the number of viable wheat midge, so the number of total cocoons less the number that are parasitized is actually what is shown in the map. And we take that number per 17 cores, do a little bit of arithmetic to get that into cocoons per meter square, and that's put out on the map here. So generally we did see some increases in wheat midge, but in the piece we saw quite a decrease, which isn't surprising considering how dry it was. This is a survey that samples this year's wheat stubble. So there very well could be cocoons that it was too dry for and just sat in the soil from 2024 wheat stubble. This is also a random survey that we conduct without variety information. So there's always a chance that at least some of these fields may have been varietal blends. So it's really important that you include your own individual field experience, what you've seen for wheat grading into your decisions about wheat midge that you make based off of this map. It can help factor into those, but those are really important. And then you can use that to make 2026 cultivar decisions if you've had wheat midge issues in the past and are considering a varietal blend, and can really help with prioritizing some of that scouting. And when you're kind of prioritizing that scouting, this is where that live map really comes in handy. So we did see some emergence occur in the piece. So even though it was dry, some of those wheat midge did still come out. We do think that we didn't see much wheat midge later on because a lot of these midge, at this point that the map was captured, it was fairly late in the season. So those midge showed up a week or two later after we saw heading begin. So there was probably a bit of mismatch in some of these fields, and the wheat just wasn't necessarily susceptible anymore. But you can pop onto that live map, see, if there's midge out and about, use that in combination with your own crop staging. So if your wheat is in that susceptible stage, and the weather forecasts to time that in-field scouting. The one nice thing about wheat midge scouting is they like to be active on an evening when it's not too bad to be sitting in a wheat field. So they're only going to be flying on calm, warm evenings. So if your crop is susceptible and there's midge showing up in the traps, not a bad idea to get out there with a friend and a brew, and you'll probably be done that counting before you finished your brew, whether it's barley based or coffee based. So if you watched this presentation and thought that you really were excited to get involved with some fun bug stuff, not only are you my type of crazy, but you really can. So we still might have some spots to run trap sites for folks that are interested. So please definitely feel free to contact us if you're interested in running traps for birth armyworm, diamondback moth, wheat midge, or corn borer. And we're always looking for folks to volunteer a field. So for our pea leaf weevil survey, our wheat midge survey, and not so much in the piece for the canola survey, but for your peas and your wheat, if you are interested, definitely let us know. We do random surveys, but trying to spot a pea field at the 4 to 6 node stage at a highway speed is always kind of challenging. So it helps to have an idea of at least a few spots to stop. And when we go out and do that surveying, we'll let you know what we find in your individual fields. So you can definitely contact us if that's something that you're interested in. And we do also have some reporting tools that you can check out. So we have our new cropped insect reporting tool, and this QR code links to a survey that takes about 5 minutes to fill out. It's completely confidential. and is set up so that you can ask your insect questions right in the form, including asking for help with identification if you see something weird that you want to snap a photo of and submit. You can also report your cut room findings and see more information at the Alberta Insect Pest Monitoring Network website there.